Good morning. This is a hearing on the pros and cons of making the Census Bureau's American Community Survey voluntary. The committee will come to order. In light of our first panel, the distinguished Representative Poe, Mr. Davis and I will wait and do our opening statements before the second panel. With that, members may have 7 days to submit opening statements and extraneous material for the record. We will now welcome our first panel. The Honorable Ted Poe represents the 2nd District of Texas. He has a long and distinguished resume, but his modesty, I'm sure, dictates that I dispense with reading that and just recognize him for his opening statement. Welcome, Your Honor.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy and Ranking Member Davis, for the opportunity to speak before this subcommittee regarding the American Community Survey. I understand today's hearing is to evaluate pros and cons of making the American Community Survey voluntary. I am here to provide a voice for the many of Americans who have called my office angry that they are forced to provide private information in response to the many invasive questions that the American Community Survey requires. Many of the callers have been from my congressional district in Texas, but even a greater number are individuals throughout the United States who are upset because they are forced to provide this personal information outside of what they believe is required under the Constitution to be given to the Census Bureau. The information that the American Community Survey asks spans from, do you have a flush toilet in your home? How many toilets do you have in your home? Does someone in your household, because of a physical, mental, emotional condition, have serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions? There are 48 questions asked in this survey, Mr. Chairman, and I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the American Community Survey form that is sent to Americans.
Without objection.
There are no doubt many benefits to the information obtained through the American Community Survey. For example, it helps allocate funding for federal programs to states and local entities. I am here to suggest that the federal government, however, does not have an overriding compelling state interest to force people to divulge their private matters in this survey. The survey should be voluntary. Congress should prohibit the federal government from forcing Americans to provide this information, such as what time they leave for work in the morning and what time they come home. People are subject to repeated harassment by contracted agents who threaten them with fines for not complying with the survey. It is also concerning how the Census Bureau obtains this personal information. Let me give you a specific case in point. One of my constituents, Linda Roberts in Kingwood, Texas, is a single mother with a young child. She received the American Community Survey last July. She filled out the information required by the Census Bureau and mailed it back to the Census Bureau. But later she began to receive weekly calls from the Bureau asking her to complete the entire survey. She refused because she had already complied with what she believed to be the requirements under the Constitution to give to the Census Bureau. And when she refused, the calls increased from every week to multiple times every day. Then a census employee started showing up at her house, ringing the doorbell and peeking through the windows to see if she was there, all for the purpose of getting her to comply with this survey. On many occasions, she came home from work in the evening to find someone sitting in their car in front of her house waiting to come so they could come and knock on the door as soon as she entered her home. Mrs. Roberts explained that she not only felt uncomfortable providing the detailed information to the federal government, but she also felt afraid every time she came to and from her own home. Mr. Chairman, where in the Constitution does the federal government have the authority to harass citizens such as this? The Supreme Court uses a least restrictive means test to assess the validity of laws that could be potentially infringing upon constitutional rights of liberty. The least restrictive means test says that if the law restricts individual liberty, it must employ the least restrictive means possible to achieve the overall goal. It is clear through Mrs. Roberts' story and through the hundreds of other calls that I have received that the Census Bureau is not using the least restrictive means to obtain the information asked in the survey. It seems they are using the most restrictive means and most intrusive means. Americans should have a choice to decide if they want to submit to evasive personal information to the Federal Government. And if they choose not to do so, they should be left alone. The Census Bureau can get the information and get accurate information by other means. Since this is not an actual counting of the people, it can do a survey like other organizations do, like pollsters, like marketing firms and private entities. And they get accurate information without harassing people and forcing them to give that information. Frankly, many Americans believe some of the information in the American Community Survey is none of the government's business, and it intrudes on their privacy. I happen to be one of them. There is no compelling state interest that should allow this intrusion into private lives. I've introduced H.R. 931, which seeks to make the American Community Survey voluntary by removing the criminal penalty imposed on the people who choose not to comply. The American people should get to choose where they want to submit their personal information to the Federal Government. They should not be forced and mandated to do so through the American Community Survey. It should be voluntary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Judge Poe, and the Ranking Member Davis and I realize that you have an extraordinarily hectic schedule with other commitments to other committees. So with that, on behalf of both of us, thank you for your willingness to testify your leadership on this issue. We will be in recess for a few minutes so the next panel can come up, and if His Honor would be willing for us to go down and shake his hand. We'll be in recess for a couple of minutes. The hearing will come to order. We will now welcome our second panel, and since we did not do our opening statements in the order in which we traditionally do them, I will recognize myself now for an opening statement, and then the distinguished gentleman from Illinois. Today, the committee is gathered for an oversight hearing on issues related to the decennial census. Specifically, we will look at the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, also known as ACS. Although ACS is relatively new, it is actually more of a continuation of the old decennial census long form. However, the ACS differs from the old long form in that it collects data every year. In theory, this provides more accurate and timely data than information gathered only every 10 years. The ACS is mailed to 300,000 households each month and 3.6 million households per year. The goal of the survey is to collect data used by the various levels of government, demographers, and even the private sector. While many regard the data as useful and helpful, the ACS is not without controversy. The objection many of us hear from constituents relates to the intrusive nature of the questions. A sample of questions include inquiries on health care plans, the number of times the recipient has been married, and whether or not the recipient has a mortgage, and if they do, how much they pay each month on the mortgage. Not content with merely asking the questions, the Federal Government aggressively pursues recipients with phone calls, visits, and threats of fines and jail time for noncompliance. Today, the subcommittee will hear from the Census Bureau and data users about the American Community Survey, its role in government policy, and how the specific questions in the survey relate to the Bureau and its perceived mission. One of the questions we're sure to hear asked today is how the results of the survey would be affected if the penalties for noncompliance were repealed. So, too, we may well hear how a census needed for the apportioning of congressional seats has morphed into something that inquires about marriage, mortgages, and the like. I'm extremely interested in hearing the perspective of our witnesses, including the one who just testified, the former judge from Texas. He's the sponsor of a bill which would take away the penalties associated with not responding to the ACS, as he just testified. I would now yield the remainder of my time to the distinguished chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for calling this important hearing. There's nothing more important to our duties as members of Congress than, in fact, to read and understand the Constitution and uphold it. At the end of the day, if we do nothing but recognize that that is our primary responsibility, if we pass no new laws and perhaps repeal a few, we probably will have done more of what the American people ultimately depend on us for than anything else. States have an absolute ability to take surveys, to pass laws, to regulate. Only the Federal Government has the mandate for the census. I've read the mandate for the census. It boils down to what is the meaning of enumeration. It is to count. Everything beyond that is outside the constitutional mandate. So as we review the existing laws that are under our jurisdiction, we have to answer just a few questions here today. Is it constitutional to demand it? The answer is it is not within the Constitution to demand this information. Is it nice to have? Yes. Is it important to have? Perhaps. Is it extremely useful? In many cases, also yes. Is this the least expensive way to accumulate this information accurately? Perhaps. But the Constitution doesn't say the government has a constitutional obligation to spend less. If it did, we wouldn't have the deficit we have before us today. So as I look at a world in which every day we have the threat of litigation, criminal prosecution, and in fact laws threaten to be passed because Facebook, Google, and thousands of other companies in and out of social media are accumulating individual information, aggregating it, and selling it to people because it is useful. You have to ask the question of what is the special role for the United States that allows us to mandate that which we probably will litigate and legislate against when the private sector does it. All these questions and more, I believe, are part of the balancing act. Our hope here today is to glean more information for the only committee that has direct jurisdiction over the mandate portion under the census. The moment this is not mandated, I'm quite sure plenty of other committees of jurisdiction will talk about the usefulness of this information. I join with the chairman in my concern that if we don't get this right, we simply haven't done the first and most important part of what we're sworn to do, uphold and defend the Constitution. I thank the Chairman and yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California. The Chair would now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank our witnesses for appearing, and I appreciate the comments of the Chairman of the overall committee. I can't help but be reminded when I think of the census and census taken that as a young community organizer, I met the most professional person I had ever seen, unknown, who opened up the census data and information to me and colleagues of mine, people where I worked, in such a way until we just became fascinated with information that existed. Her name was Mary Grady. She retired a few years ago, and she's no longer here. But she was the most professional bureaucrat, I guess, that I'd ever seen. And I always fondly remember her. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this hearing, and I thank you for calling it, because the American Community Survey is, in fact, beneficial to our nation in many ways. Funding for education, transportation, and human services are determined largely based upon data gathered by the ACS. ACS statistics provide a means of testing the effectiveness of our civil rights and anti-discrimination laws. The ACS is a tool that guides the proper targeting of hundreds of billions of dollars by the federal government. Local and state governments also rely on data collected by the ACS and use the data to target local funds. ACS data are also critical to large and small businesses, nonprofits, and academic researchers. The integrity of the ACS would be fundamentally challenged, however, by Congressman Poe's bill, which would remove the traditional legal requirement to answer census questions fully and truthfully. The Census Bureau reports that a voluntary ACS would cost much more to administer, and the data would be less reliable. As stewards of public dollars, we should seek the most cost-effective manner to reach our ultimate goal. I appreciate the fact that some citizens have concerns about their privacy. Congress has made it a felony offense to make a wrongful disclosure of personal information gathered by the census. Some complain about the time it takes to complete the survey. The Census Bureau requests a mere 45 minutes to complete the ACS. It is a civic duty and a mark of good citizenship, and I also think a level of patriotism and patriotic spirit for individuals to be engaged in providing this information as we seek to make our country as responsive and as effective as it can possibly be. In this area of Gaga, Twitter, Wikipedia, Facebook, and online dating, where people share the most intimate details of their lives for the world to view. As a matter of fact, they just kind of do it automatically. As a matter of fact, they even do it on television shows where they come. I'm not convinced that there is an overwhelming number of citizens in our country who are seriously regarding this as an invasion of their privacy, although some do. I have today several letters from interest groups encouraging Congress to preserve the ACS as we know it, and I'd like to submit these, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And I also like to forward them, look forward to the hearing from our witnesses. And, Mr. Chairman, I know we're looking at and thinking about and talking about some limitations relative to the participation of people. But it's kind of difficult for me to believe that the accuracy of information that we will have would be the same using survey techniques and approaches and other methods. And I think part of what I'm relating to is the fact that I've used the Census Bureau and the census data for so long, and I've become so intimate with some of the people who have worked for the Bureau. As a matter of fact, I think the longest serving individual happens to run the operation out of Region 5, Stanley Moore. And Stanley has become almost an institution in himself, in the lives of many of the professional groups, colleges and universities, not-for-profits, until we may have a little different view of the importance of the Census Bureau than some other people who have not had as much intimate contact as we've been favored with. So I would hope that not only would we do this hearing today, but that we would have additional hearings so that we can further explore the impact of what is before us. And so I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman from Illinois. We will now welcome our second panel of witnesses. The Honorable Dr. Robert Groves is the Director of the U.S. Census Bureau. Dr. Andrew Biggs is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Lawrence Yoon is Chief Economist at the National Association of Realtors. And Mr. Patrick Jankowski is Vice President for Research at the Greater Houston Partnership. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses other than members of Congress must be sworn in before they testify, so I would ask you to please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? May the record reflect all witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. I will recognize you from my left to right, your right to left, and the lights will mean what they traditionally mean in life, with red meaning kind of maybe go ahead and finish that thought that you have. Don't forget to turn on your microphone before you speak, and with that, it is my pleasure to recognize Dr. Groves for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy. Ranking Member Davis, I'm delighted to be here to talk about this, the American Community Survey and its role in the country. I must note that because of changes we've seen in our society at the Census Bureau, we're in the middle of reorganizing how we do things to reflect changes in the society that have been mentioned already. We've launched a reorganization of the Bureau. We've crafted a cost efficiency program that is based on staff proposals for saving money. We're taking every opportunity to save pennies in order to invest in innovation, and I detail those in my full testimony that I submit for the committee for the record, if possible. One of the things we're doing that's different is using the American Community Survey as a tool to make the 2020 census more efficient. It's a key vehicle in the planning of the 2020 census, and through that we believe that we will produce both a more cost-efficient decennial census and a better ACS over time. So what is the ACS? It is literally this country's only source of small area statistics throughout the country, available for all the communities in the nation. As the successor to the decennial census long form, it's the only sample household survey that is mandatory by law. It thereby achieves the highest rates of participation of all surveys, approaching 98% of the population. The vast majority of households that are sampled into the survey choose to participate. And we've tried to limit the burden of the survey by limiting the sample size to about 2.5% of the households each year. So we're conscious of that challenge to us. The products produced by the American Community Survey amount annually to 11 billion statistics that inform local communities and businesses down to very small areas of space. That amounts to about 2 cents a statistic in terms of the efficiency of the survey. We'll talk a lot today about uses of the survey. I'd be happy to do that in Q&A. I want to focus in on the key issues that I believe are of concern to the subcommittee. So why do we ask these questions? For example, why do we ask a question, does this person have difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions? And does this person have difficulty dressing or bathing? Knowing the spatial distribution of the disabled population in the United States is crucial, both for Federal programs that serve them, for the Veterans Administration that has to serve disabled veterans, for the industry that serves the elderly and is designing living quarters for them throughout the country. And it's for that reason that we use the standards from the Institute of Medicine to form those questions. Why is the survey mandatory? The U.S. Constitution empowers Congress to carry out the census in such manner as they shall by law direct. That is unambiguous in the Constitution. When the Founding Fathers, many of whom were members of the First Congress, passed the Census Act in March of 1790, it became obvious that their intent was to make that mandatory. There was a $40 fine in 1790 for not complying to the census. The long form of the census has evolved to the American Community Survey. As the long form was mandatory, so too has the American Community Survey that replaced it been voluntary. What would happen if we changed this to a voluntary survey? In 2003, Congress directed the Census Bureau to do an experiment, a piece of research to answer that question. We found that a voluntary test yielded respondent participation at lower levels in all 3 modes of data collection. That led to an increase in survey costs because we follow up those who did not respond on the male side. That produces smaller numbers of cases for just those neighborhoods I described, which means the estimates from the sample survey are more unstable. If we turned ACS into a voluntary survey, we estimate roughly that it would increase the cost by about $66 million a year. For all these reasons, we are in the middle of a top-to-bottom program review of the ACS that will be finished in December 2012. And I'd be happy to talk more on all these topics. I appreciate being here and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Groves. Dr. Biggs.
Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today with regard to the American Community Survey, and in particular the legal requirement that Americans participate in the ACS. This issue involves important questions of both individual privacy and lawmakers' need for accurate data upon which to make important policy decisions. In the United States, we have sought to achieve an appropriate balance between these two needs. It is my opinion that mandatory participation in the ACS, coupled with legal protections for privacy of ACS respondents, maintains that balance in a reasonable way. The American Community Survey replaced the census long form, which previously had gathered detailed information on a subset of the U.S. population. Roughly 1 in 6 census respondents were required to fill out the long form in addition to the standard census questionnaire. Researchers have pointed out technical pros and cons of the ACS versus the census long form. The annual sample size of the ACS is smaller than for the census long form, but the ACS is produced every year, whereas the long form was generated only every 10 years. For that reason, the ACS allows for better real-time analysis and better tracking of trends from year to year. These abilities clearly would be of interest to policymakers in Congress and the administration. But the ACS and the long form are similar in that participation in both was mandated by law. Like for the long form, mandatory participation in the ACS is controversial and raises legitimate privacy concerns of which policymakers should remain cognizant. However, for several reasons, I believe that mandatory participation in the ACS remains a reasonable policy. First, the greater detail of information captured by the ACS has allowed the standard census questionnaire to become less detailed. Thus, for the typical American, the census process may have become less intrusive over time. Second, the same law that mandates individual participation in the ACS also makes it illegal for the Census Bureau to release data in such a way that an individual's privacy might be violated. Any census employee who violates the privacy of census data faces significant jail time and large monetary fines. I am not personally aware of any instance in which ACS respondents, or for that matter respondents to any census survey, have had their privacy violated in this way. Third, and most importantly, without good data, policymakers are essentially flying blind, lacking solid knowledge of the Americans they are seeking to assist. We already suffer too much from what might be referred to as policymaking by anecdote, where lawmakers seek to pass legislation before significantly examining the severity or sometimes even the existence of a perceived problem. Reducing the quantity and quality of data available to policymakers, analysts, and researchers threatens to exacerbate this problem. Moreover, it is likely that with voluntary participation, data will fall short most for individuals and households on whom government policy is most focused, including the poor, the less educated, and those with poorer language skills. In my own research, I have found the ACS filled gaps in existing data sets and allowed for analysis that would have been difficult or impossible to conduct in its absence. For instance, I am currently using the ACS in ongoing research on public sector compensation, some of which has been presented in hearings before the full Oversight Committee. For much of that research, we use the Census Bureau's current population survey. However, the ACS contains more detailed information that has allowed us to better control for the different skills of public and private sector employees, as well as much more detailed geographic location that allows us to look at where certain employees are located. Setting public sector compensation at appropriate levels impacts the quality of the government workforce at the Federal, State, and local levels and can have fiscal repercussions potentially worth hundreds of billions of dollars per year. Without good data, though, this kind of analysis is extremely difficult to undertake. Those who wish to make participation in the ACS voluntary raise important points, and we should not allow our concern for individual privacy to fade, even if we judge that mandatory participation is the best policy course. In the United States, the government exists to serve the people, not vice versa. Nevertheless, I believe that government can best serve the American people by continuing to gather high-quality survey data. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Biggs. Dr. Yoon.
Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today and offer a realtor perspective on the American Community Survey. I am here to testify on behalf of approximately 1 million realtor members who are involved in residential and commercial real estate. I would like to discuss how NAR uses the ACS data. ACS provides an important input to NAR's estimation of existing home sales, as delineated in the appendix of this testimony. NAR's monthly sales estimate based on information from a comprehensive sample of multiple listing services around the country. However, NAR does not obtain information on every single sales transaction. For example, for sale by owner sales, we will not be able to capture. Rather, NAR has the data for a representative sample of home sales on a monthly basis, and then it is grossed up to obtain an estimate for total national existing home sales each month. Information from ACS provides the basis for this gross up. Based on the information in yearly ACS, we are able to obtain a benchmark level of sales, that is an estimated level of total home sales in a given year. We then use the sample data from the multiple listing service to estimate the total monthly sales based on this benchmark. Without the availability of ACS, we probably would not have an accurate measure of the existing home sales market, and it is well known that home sales are one of the important drivers of the economy. Timely information on an important part of the economy would no longer be available. This combination of public and private data provides information on a major part of our economy, information that is of interest to decision makers, the homeowners, and a variety of stakeholders. Another use of ACS is the computing of the Housing Affordability Index at the local level. NAR publishes a closely watched affordability index, which is based on mortgage rates, home prices, and local household income. We rely on ACS to provide the local income measurements. One of the popular reports that we provide for our Realtor members is the Local Housing Market Report. Included in the report are sales, price, housing start trends. We also include information on population shifts and income trends and the data set that come from the ACS. Our Realtor members from a faster growing states such as Arizona, Utah, state of Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and my home state of South Carolina are particularly delighted to hear about the changing population shifts in their state's favor, recognizing that my observations in these conversations are just anecdotal. The major value of ACS is that it is based on random, statistically accurate sample permitting research analysis at the national, state, and local levels. The key word is random. A significant non-response error could be introduced if the participation in the survey were optional. Moving to a voluntary response to ACS would no doubt reduce response rates, particularly among minority households, low-income households, and from rural communities. The accuracy and comprehensiveness of the survey is extremely important. Conclusions from a non-random survey could be incorrect and misleading. For these reasons, it is important that households selected for the survey be counted in the database. The option of not answering the survey could bias and render meaningless conclusions based on the database. I thank you for the opportunity to present our comments on the American Community Survey. So in concluding, data integrity is important, and I hope the American Community Survey can continue to obtain the necessary response rates needed to assure the development of accurate and meaningful conclusions.
Thank you, Dr. Yoon, and it's good to have someone from South Carolina here. Mr. Jankowski.
I want to start by thanking Chairman Gowdy. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Davis for inviting me here to talk about the American Community Survey. My name is Patrick Jankowski. I'm the Vice President of Research at the Greater Houston Partnership. We're an economic development organization. One of the things that we do at the partnership is we try to grow the region's economy. We try to grow jobs. We try to expand the tax base. We try to bring investment to the region. Basically what we're trying to do is build prosperity in the region. This is a job that I've been doing for about 30 years now. Believe it or not, 30 years. I started out of college in '81 doing this. The way you recruit businesses to a region has changed so much over the last 30 years. When I first got started, we'd have a company call us up. They'd want to know, do you have a piece of real estate and is it rail served? That's all they wanted to know. It's real estate and infrastructure. But that was in the old economy. That was back when it was the industrial age. Now we're in the information age. We're in the global economy. When we work with companies and companies come to the region, they want to know something, yes, about real estate. They want to know something about infrastructure. But one of the most key issues that they're asking is they want to know about the workforce. And they want to know about the demographics of the region that they work in and that they're looking at putting it in. It's the nature of the questions they ask. We'll be working with a Japanese firm. A Japanese firm will be looking at coming to Houston, and they're going to want to know, they ask us, what is the size of your Asian community? What's the size of your Japanese community? They want to know because they need to make sure that their expat workers that they assign to come to Houston are going to feel comfortable working there. We'll be working with an engineering firm, and the engineering firm will want to know, obviously, how many engineers do you have? How many technicians do you have in the region? They want to know that, so if they relocate to Houston, they open up in Houston, if they're bringing jobs to Houston, they'll be able to meet their staffing needs. We work with office centers and call centers. They ask us about commute times. One of the reasons they want to know about commute times, they want to know, is it going to be difficult for their employees to get to work? They want to know if it's going to create staffing problems. These are real-life examples. We've got 100 Japanese firms in Houston now we've been able to recruit because we have this sort of data. With the engineering firms specifically, we had Vestas Wind Energy, a Danish company, Scandinavian company, came to Houston to do development and R&D work in Houston because we all provide them with the data with the engineers. And just about any company that looks at Houston wants to know about commute times. And it's so important that we have this good data, the data we get from the ACS. And it's also so important because just the nature of the changes which have been occurring in the economy, which has been occurring in the population over the last 10 years. It's so important that we get the ACS data on a regular basis. Houston, for example, added 1.2 million people in the last decade. And of that, 745,000 of those were Hispanic. If we didn't have the ACS data, we wouldn't see these changes which are going on in our population. Consider there were 5 metropolitan areas that added over 1 million people between the censuses. If you look at, there were another 6 that added 500,000. There are another 50 that added over 100,000. There are about, let me check my notes real quick, there are 51 metropolitan areas that lost population between the census. If we didn't have the ACS data, we wouldn't be able to see these changes which are going on. Now, Houston's been fairly successful. We actually had a pretty good year last year. We actually were able to recruit about 34 companies to the region or convince them not to leave the region. And I'm not saying the ACS data is the sole thing which kept them there. We like to think we have a good business climate. But we are able to provide them with the data so they can understand the population, they can understand the workforce, and be comfortable in making a decision to invest in the region, to create jobs in the region, to grow our tax base. And I'm not unique. You know, I like to think I'm unique, but I'm not unique. There are at least 5,000 other organizations like mine across the U.S., small cities, counties, states, that are trying to recruit businesses to the region. They rely very heavily on ACS data when they're trying to make their pitches to convince companies to relocate to the region. So if we make the ACS voluntary, as my fellow panelists have talked about, the quality of the data is going to go down. And if the quality of the data goes down, we're not giving the business community the sort of information, the good information they need to make these business decisions. And that's the reason I like to say I think making the ACS voluntary is a bad decision. We need to continue to give the business community good information so they can make good business decisions and help grow our tax bases and our jobs and increase investment. Once again, thank you for allowing me to speak, and I'm ready to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jankowski. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I want to be extremely clear at the outset. I don't doubt for a second the helpfulness of the information. I don't doubt for a second the importance of the information. What I'm trying to determine is whether or not it's important enough to send someone to jail who doesn't answer it. So let me ask you this, Mr. Biggs. Do you think it's important to register to vote?
Do I think it's important to, well, voting is voluntary. So
that's not my question. My question is it helpful and important to vote?
Sure.
In fact, one could argue that that is the ultimate national survey, right?
Correct.
If you want to take a mood on how people feel and what they're thinking, go check the election results. Now, what's the penalty for not registering?
In our country, nothing.
What's the penalty for not voting?
Nothing.
So you can understand how vexing it would be to some of us when the census was designed and calculated so you can apportion the different congressional seats. I mean, that's why we have a census. I don't think anyone's going to argue that the founders put that in the Constitution so we could have more demographic information for realtors. It's to apportion the congressional seats. So that's the reason we have a census, but yet we don't punish people for not registering to vote. We don't punish people for not voting, and no one's advocating that we do, but we do punish people who don't respond to portions of this form that have nothing to do with that right. So I want to walk through not the helpfulness of it. I don't doubt that. I'm not even doubting the importance of it. I want to ask about the constitutional grounding of being able to ask this. So, Director, I want to start with you and ask what level of scrutiny you think we should apply. I've heard the word compelling interest. I've heard important interest. Those are two different levels of constitutional scrutiny. So would you say that the government has a compelling interest in this information or just an interest in this information?
So if you go to the words in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, it clearly gives Congress the responsibility to direct how the census is done.
Agreed.
And so then in order to understand what the intent was, what I think past Congresses have done is to look at the First Census Act. And there it's absolutely clear, I think, by most historians read of that the intent was a full enumeration of the population in order that the reapportionment was equitably and fairly done, and the mandatory nature is specified from the get-go.
I don't want to cut you off. I've only got 2 minutes now, and I need to go through the form with you to ask you whether or not the governmental interest is important or compelling, because there's a different analysis. The courts that look at this will have a different analysis if you say it's compelling versus if you say it's important. The first several questions, I don't think anyone challenges. You have to know the age so you can apportion voting age population. You can't stuff a district with only people under the age of 18. So you have to know the age, you have to know the gender, and you have to know the race. I'm fine with compelling people to answer that. Whether or not someone is forgetful, do you agree with me that the First Amendment, while it protects your right to speak, also protects your right not to speak?
With all due respect, I'm not sure whether it matters whether I agree, but what the intent of Congresses has been over the decades, and Congresses have specified additional information, and then the courts have, in discussions not unlike this, asked the question, is it right that the government compel? And those cases seem clear that the intent of those Congresses was upheld by the courts.
I think those cases dealt with the Fourth Amendment and not the First Amendment, which is why I asked you specifically about the First Amendment.
All right,
those were privacy cases. Those weren't speech cases.
I am not an attorney.
I'm not much of one either, but my reading of them is those were Fourth Amendment and not First Amendment cases. So what, and I'm almost out of time. Perhaps we'll have a second panel. Again, I'm not, no one has to convince me it's helpful. Before all the realtors email me and call me from back home, nobody has to convince me it's important. Nobody has to convince me it's helpful. What you have to convince me of is that it is important and helpful enough to send a person to jail who wants to exercise their right not to answer it. So with that, I would recognize the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I think maybe we might have to have a second round. Because you've sort of
I ran out of time.
Generated some thoughts in even my mind relative to the whole question of congressional intent. And it seems to me that I think the intent was to get as much information as was considered useful at the time. And I agree that there are changes that have been occurring. And as those changes have taken place, we readjust and readjust our thinking in relationship to what is needed. I think there are even bodies of knowledge now that did not exist in 1790. And so they would not have thought necessarily of the usefulness of some things. And I guess trying to form this more perfect union, I mean, I guess they knew it wasn't perfect, still isn't, but it's in formation. And every time we learn something new and readjust, then I think we're moving towards the perfection that we hope to have, even though I don't think we'll ever get there, because if we ever got there, then we'd have to stop. As I was thinking about the issue, my question has become, even if we find ways to save money in one way, and I think everybody associated with government are thinking about government, are thinking, how do we get the most mileage out of what we're spending? And oftentimes I'm reminded of an individual who lived, back before some of this was written and all, a guy named Frederick Douglass, who always said there was one thing that he knew if he didn't know anything else. And that is, he knew that in this world, we may not get everything that we pay for, but we most certainly must pay and will pay for everything that we get. And if we don't pay one way, then we'll pay another way. And so if there is some information that is needed to make a certain kind of decision, and we don't have that data, or if the data that we have is not as accurate as perhaps it could have been, and maybe we make an error, and the error may outweigh what would have been the cost of another level of accuracy. Do either one of you think that that is something that we ought to be thinking about as we think of streamlining and reducing and trying to spend the least amount of money that we possibly can with the greatest level of effectiveness? Mr. Director, let me begin with you.
The question of the mandatory nature of ACS is related to your points through an indirect effect of making the ACS a voluntary survey. And if it became voluntary, as the past research showed, the very small area uses that these gentlemen have mentioned and other people around the country rely on ACS for, those uses are threatened, mainly because of the production of very unstable estimates at the low level. What happens with unstable estimates is that schools will be built in neighborhoods where there aren't enough kids, retail stores will be built that won't fulfill their sales projections, roads will be built where cars won't need them. There are costs to the quality impacts and the instability of estimates at the small area. So in thinking through these trade-offs, I think it's critical to talk also about the costs of the cost side of change.
Thank the gentleman from Illinois. Mr. Jankowski, are there any questions that can't be asked?
I haven't gone through the whole survey to look at which questions can be asked. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, are there any questions in general that can't be asked? I mean, what's off limits?
I mean, in philosophically, I'm sure.
Well, not even philosophically. If the standard we're going to use is what's helpful and what's important, can you ask the people at that residence whether they've committed any crimes in the last 12 months? Because heavens knows we need to apportion law enforcement services.
I think there's something in the Constitution against self-incrimination, and I think
there is. There's the Fifth Amendment. It comes right 4 down from the First Amendment, which says you don't have to talk.
Yes, and so in that case, that sort of question would be off limits.
What about whether or not someone takes any pharmaceuticals and to list the drugs they take by name, so EMS can know when they respond whether or not there are any counterindications in terms of what how they treat someone in the case of an emergency? Can you ask what drugs are being consumed there?
In a census form?
Sure.
I don't see the practical application of something like that.
Well, how about whether or not the person there has trouble concentrating?
That I can see, because you need to be able to deliver services to a geographic area, and if you have some understanding of
what service, what service would be impacted by a lack of concentration that wouldn't be impacted by what kind of pharmaceuticals you're taking?
That's sort of like nursing homes, daycare for the elderly, things of that nature, services that you would provide, social services to provide people who are having difficulty taking care of their elderly relatives.
And I've heard reliable used a lot. Is self-diagnosis the most reliable way to get that information?
No, it's not. I don't think it's an issue of self-diagnosis. I think this is an issue of someone who's probably already been diagnosed in their household by their doctor, and they're just confirming on the form what has already been diagnosed by a medical professional.
Can you ask them what kind of magazines they read, what kind of TV shows they watch?
I think Nielsen does that.
Well, that's my point. There are a lot of other people who ask these same questions. I mean, is the mortgage information available from other sources?
I probably need to defer that one to my colleague to the right. That's not an area that I'm very well based in, is mortgage information.
Well, Dr. Groves, is any of this information available from other sources?
Some of the questions are asked in other surveys done both by other federal agencies and the private sector. But what is unique about ACS is that the questions are asked of the same individual. That allows us to say not only what is the prevalence of disability in the country, but what portion of the disabled are veterans. It allows, since we ask both those questions, we can target the use of the information in a much more helpful way for small area decisions that are being made. That's the strength.
The annual payment for fire, hazard, and flood insurance, the amount, is that information available from other sources?
Yes, but once again, that single item in conjunction with other items allow us to calculate and to give to the Housing and Urban Development Department estimated living costs by housing type, and that's critical in Section 8 administration.
Well, I'm going to ask the question again. What standard is the standard we should be using?
I think it's very simple.
What?
It really is.
Give me a simple answer.
We have attempted to go through the questions on the ACS and ask of each one, is there a legal mandate to collect these? I believe we can send this to you at any moment's notice that details the statutes that require the collection of that information either by the American Community Survey itself or by the Census Bureau in service of other federal government agencies. And then there are all the business uses that are not mandated statutorily, but are useful. That distinction I'm with you on. I believe that's an appropriate distinction for Congress to make.
What questions can't be asked?
What questions?
Cannot be asked.
In a similar meaning of the term that you...
Yeah, I mean, I'm just, can you ask about medicines? Because EMS does need to know when they're treating someone at the house.
I believe that would not meet the standards of the American Community Survey. So our question is, where is the statute that requires the collection of information for the use for the common good? If we find it, that's the threshold we're looking for in the American Community Survey.
My time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Voluntary versus mandatory ACS in 2003 and 2004, the findings demonstrated an over 20% decrease in participation when the answers were voluntary. This seemed to me to be a large decrease for a limited population, and the Census Bureau concluded that moving to a voluntary ACS would compromise the quality of the data and increase the cost of administering the ACS. In addition to that, it seems to me, if you are making decisions about something and you have 20% less information or less accurate information, would that drive up the cost of not only getting the data that you need, but would it also compromise the likelihood of the validity or the highest level of validity of decision-making that then would occur?
It is clear to me that the credibility of the ACS statistics used by people throughout the country is dependent on the rate of participation we get. It is also clear from the 2003 studies that that participation rate would go down with a voluntary survey. Our estimates are that roughly 600,000 houses that are responding now, relative to the about 2 million that respond each year, would be threatened under this. And it's important, I think, to understand why. The first receipt of an American Community Survey is through the mail. And all of us sort through our mail, making a decision about whether to open the envelope or not. Is it important enough to gain our attention? The American Community Survey has a message on the envelope that notes the legal basis and the mandatory nature. That has been shown through the research to be an effective tool merely to open the envelope. And once the vast majority of people do that, they then end up eventually completing the survey. So it is important to talk about the trade-off. What would happen if we made ACS voluntary? Imagine that world. And we're blessed that an earlier edition of this committee urged us to do that research. We now have the research findings. And the research findings suggest that some of the key uses of ACS are gutted by the voluntary nature, and we have to talk about that.
Of individuals being penalized for not complying or not answering the questions, and individuals may end up potentially becoming incarcerated. And certainly given the fact that we incarcerate more people than anybody else in the world, I wouldn't want to see anybody incarcerated because they refused to answer some census information that was inquired. Do we have much record of people having been prosecuted for refusing to answer questions on census forms?
I've been in this job since 2009, and I asked the same questions about how we implemented the mandatory nature. And I can't find an example of prosecution attempts on ACS. And when I ask why is it mandatory and why don't we prosecute, the answer is that we've found over time that the note that this is mandatory and our ability of our interviewers to explain why these data are so important are much more effective than any prosecution could be. So no one has been fined, is what I'm told, because of noncompliance with ACS. And I remind us that the rate of participation is about 98% of the sample. This is extraordinarily high. There's no other survey in the United States that reached this level of participation.
Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Illinois. The Chair would now recognize the gentleman from California, the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jankowski, short answer, hopefully. The information from the census is useful and you'd like to have it, right?
Yes, sir.
It's valuable and you'd like to have it.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Young, same would be true. The information is useful and you'd like to have it. It's valuable and you'd like to have it.
Yes. If it is a random sample, if it's not a random sample, then the results would not be that meaningful.
You want good you want good data. It's valuable.
Yes.
Dr. Biggs, you're maybe a little less interested in it, but would you agree that this is valuable information?
I have no financial interest, but yes, it is valuable information.
And you know that the private sector, associations, and true private sector, they want to have it, they use it, and it's valuable to them.
That's correct.
They get it for free, right?
Yes, they do.
Okay. Director, your turn. You're not selling this. It's valuable. Statutorily, you're not allowed to sell it. Is that correct?
We are not. I am not sure about the
okay.
The
well, let me get to the question behind the
sure,
question.
Sure.
If ultimately one of your great defenses is it would cost more to do it another way, then the first question is, you can offset that by having the right to sell this very valuable information. So cost is a false facade. It's a canard, right? Ultimately, cost is something you're saying, but it's not something you particularly care about as long as the revenue necessary, either given to you by the taxpayers or provided to be collected for this valuable information. You don't have a problem with the raised cost then, do you? In other words, cost, Mark McCormick, he's passed away now, but he was a business writer, and he described what a problem is. And Director, you know what a problem is?
No.
It's something money won't solve. So my first question to you, and the most important question for me in this hearing is, could money solve this problem statistically?
That's a great question, first of all. It's a question I think about a lot. And I can say that if there were an increase in the budget, which I think your question is implying.
Well, in the budget for this particular line item, let's not go too far here today.
Okay. Then it is unambiguous that we could restore the size of the data set, as it were, that produces the estimates from ACS. And then the critical question, as these gentlemen have noted, is would that reestablished size produce the same estimates? We've done some simulation on this, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. So
let's
jury's still out on the answer.
Okay, but let's go around to a more studied area. Director, you've written fairly extensively that you view that enumeration could be done by estimation. That in fact, the mandate under the Constitution, which we do argue about here in Congress, that says you will count, could in fact be extrapolated for greater accuracy. Literally, the convincing argument that has not carried the day is that minorities are underrepresented in the census because, in fact, they don't answer, they have these other reasons that they're not counted, and therefore a extrapolation could increase the accuracy. You're well familiar with the issue, and you and I have even talked about it in the past, right?
Yeah, I don't believe I've ever written a single word on this, but I understand what you're saying, yes.
Okay. So, but that whole point is that we could potentially change outcomes using further analysis. In this case, where there's no constitutional mandate and thus no compelling reason, under the Constitution at least, to mandate people answer against their first, fourth, fifth, and damn it, I just have a right to liberty set of constitutional rights. Because there is sort of that life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. You know, it doesn't necessarily fit in the 10, but it's clearly there. So back to the basic question. One, given enough money, you can overcome this, or at least given enough money, you can find out if you can overcome it and to what accuracy, right?
It would require a research program to nail it.
Okay, well, let's just do a what if here. If you, in fact, did a blind study or double-blind study or triple-blind study, you guys are much better at the terms for it, and you did both, and I say triple, and if I could ask an additional minute, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Thank you. Where you had the straight voluntary, you had sort of the first 4 questions voluntary, you had the first 4 questions voluntary, and then follow-up to try to encourage people to participate, even if, in fact, they were reticent to do so. But ultimately, that would be compared against today the you are going to jail if you don't answer this type of a threat. If you did that, you would know more than you know today. Is that correct, Director?
That's correct.
And once you do that, you would know whether or not you could receive, for the benefit of these people to your left, because they want this information in many cases. It's valuable information, and they think that you're a better source of it for free than the people they pay millions of dollars to get it. Right?
That's right. Canada just did this. It's interesting that there may be.
Thank God it's not Sweden. I love it when it's Canada instead of Sweden.
And they're still grappling with the results, as I understand it. So it didn't work out according to expectations. I note that.
But in their case, they did these blind tests. They didn't, or did they change systems?
They switched their so-called long form to voluntary, mounted it as a survey after their census in 2011, and there was a massive decline, an unexpectedly large decline.
Okay, my time is expired. Mr. Chairman, are we going to have another round?
Mr. Davis and I have had a second round. Mr. Chairman, you are welcome to also have a second round.
Well, thank you. I'll be briefer in my second round than my first. This is so important, and there is so much question about whether or not the word mandate is necessary, and if so, to what questions. And I think this is where, Mr. Jankowski, you were very good at answering some things and a little bit more deferring in others. At the end of the day, can't we all agree that not every question has a compelling federal interest that mandates it? Well, Mr. Young, there are things which do not have a compelling federal interest, but you sure as heck would like to get the information. Can we all agree that that's sort of part of what this study is? It's not just about the absolute minimum. It is about nice to have information, and in some cases must have information, and then it's a question of how you get it. Is that sort of where the two of you would be, is you'd like to have the information and you know some of it is needed, but some of it that we get, you really appreciate whether it's needed or not?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Biggs, in your case, you're sort of my libertarian friend here for a moment. If we can ask for this information and people voluntarily give it, and we can statistically make it accurate for the other side, and if we recover the cost in some way that's beneficial to the taxpayer, either because the additional information is valuable enough for him to pay for it or her to pay for it, or we sell it, are you okay, Dr. Biggs, with that?
In general, yes. I mean, you can make the economic argument for government conducting what we call basic research, and I think this would fit into the category of that. But I think in general, I would. I think it's in this case. I mean, I'm a pretty libertarian person. I mean, the number of programs and departments I think are unconstitutional would probably shock even you. But I think for somebody who's often accused of wanting to gut the government, I think the first thing you want, the place to start is not sort of the eyes and ears of knowing what is going on out there. And because if you cut that source of information, all the other government programs become less efficient. And so because they're less efficient, you're extracting more from people than you otherwise would have to. You're serving them less well than you otherwise would. That has a cost, not just financially, but a cost to their freedom. So I think the libertarian argument cuts both ways, that I'm all for cutting government. Is this the first thing we should cut? I don't really think so.
Well, Director, I'm going to close with you. It looks like you have a great mandate here. You have a group of people who want to find a way to do this less onerously. You have a dais who is committed to make sure that information that is valuable to the taxpayers directly and indirectly is made available. You do have some pushback on the mandated. It appears as though you don't currently have the kind of parallel, both study in Canada and, in fact, doing your own work with these various levels potentially. And I put those out as a person who only had to take the required stats to get a business degree. You certainly eclipse, you eclipse what my teachers had, so let's just put it that way. That's an invitation, I would say, for you to come to us with your proposals for how we get a win-win. Can we, in fact, have Dr. Biggs get what he wants, which is that the onerous nature of mandate fades to zero potentially? Dr. Young and Dr. Jankowski, and I have a friend, Jankowski, so let me get it right once and all, but I just can't see that far. They seem like they're fine with voluntary. They just want to make sure it's equally accurate. I'm sitting on the dais saying, and I don't want the taxpayers to have to get a big increase unless it's absolutely mandated. So can you come back to this committee in relatively short time with at least some draft ideas of how we could work together to get the win for the three people to your left, and the win for Mr. Poe and the other people who believe that today this mandate in its current form needs to go away completely. The committee would certainly like to find a win-win. Can you do that for us?
I think this is the proper role for me and my colleagues to comment on the technical matters and for you to address these more philosophical matters of what should be mandated, and be happy to do so.
I thank you. I've never had a bad hearing with you or a bad meeting with you, so this doesn't surprise me. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Davis, and Mr. Clay, who's joined us, I thank you for this hearing. I think it's a good first step. We obviously are the exclusive committee of jurisdiction for the census, and we take it seriously, and I thank the Chairman and yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California. The Chair would now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for coming today. And it's good to see Director Groves again. I appreciate the hard work that you and the Bureau did during the 2010 census, and I believe it was one of the most accurate and complete we've ever done. I am, however, concerned that this is the first time that this committee in the 112th Congress is examining an issue related to the census. When I took over as chair of this subcommittee in 2007, and I discovered that during the previous 7 years, my friends on the other side of the aisle had held only 2 hearings about the 2010 census. 7 years into the planning, most of the decisions had been made. Many of them, unfortunately, had been poor decisions that would have created major problems and yielded poor results. Without any oversight from the then majority, there was a great likelihood of failure. And we took great care and made great efforts in the following 4 years to rectify the problems. And we did, and we provided oversight. We held hearings and we investigated. We asked the GAO to provide us with numerous reports. Let me say that the GAO did an outstanding job, but we engaged with the Bureau and we listened to an enormous number of stakeholders, and we did it all transparently through more than 20 hearings. We have not had much follow-up from the 2010 census, so hopefully we will begin that process, Mr. Chair. And if this is about the American Community Survey, or ACS, I am sure others will be able to give many details on how the ACS came to be and how it is a great benefit to us all. And they will tell us how participation will decline significantly if the ACS were to be made voluntary. And I would like to go on the record to say that I am opposed to making the ACS voluntary. And I hope that the majority realizes the importance of the census, and I hope that they are as committed to an accurate and complete count as possible as I am. And with that, Mr. Chairman, let me ask one question of the panel, and that is, and I'll start with Director Groves. Mr. Groves, there are some who suggest that the private sector should pay for census data collection. Could you address this idea and the possible ramifications of an effort like this?
We haven't considered this seriously, so I can comment that it would be near unique in the world if the United States chose to do this. Other countries, I think, have taken the posture that this is a basic responsibility of the central government to monitor and keep track of how we're doing as an economy and a society. and that in a democracy, the free and equitable distribution of this information is key to the notion of the society. So I don't know what money would be made off of this if we tried to sell it. It is clear that there are companies that use these data, combine them with other statistics, and add value and sell these as part of their business model. So there's a bit of that. But I have no idea what would happen if the United States chose to do this and whether the results would be a desirable set or not.
But it's also clear that the business community relies on data to make business decisions on where they locate their businesses and basically how commerce flows in this country.
Oh, it is crystal clear that successful American firms are using empirical data to make day-to-day decisions, and that what products are stocked in a particular site of a particular national store is determined somewhat by our data. So American business runs on these data, and we'd have to think this through.
I see my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Sure.
Gentleman's recognized for some additional time.
Thank you. 2 minutes.
Additional 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Anyone else on the panel have any thoughts about the data collection and whether the private sector should pay for it? Dr. Young.
Like Dr. Biggs mentioned, that there are certain basic information I think that government can provide rather than forcing upon the private sector to pay upon that benefits the country as a whole. Let me relate just one long story. I grew up in South Korea and was raised in South Carolina, fortunately. Grew up in South Korea, but my parents went through the Korean War. And it could have just as easy that we could have been following under the other regime. The other regime did not collect data, or they have, I should say, that there's a tremendous amount of consensus among economists, researchers in America, even though there are disagreements here and there. And I think that the level of agreement that is in America compared to, say, other countries that are so divided, North and South Korea, is because of the prevalence of the data, that we can see it. We let the statistics speak for itself. So I think there's a tremendous value in having the basic information where the research people can look into it and find the consensus ground as to what makes sense and what does not make sense.
Thank you for that response. Mr. Jankowski, any comments?
Just one comment. I can see the business community coming back and saying, this is something I'm already paying taxes on. If I'm already paying taxes for it, why am I subsidizing it a second time? Right. Also, I think if we're, as panelist to my right, as the director said, we need to understand who we are in the U.S. We need to understand what's the forces that are shaping us. We need to understand the demographic shifts. I think it's so important to gather this information so we simply know what's going on in the country. So.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, before we close, could I have just a moment?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman.
I just want to follow up. Mr. Clay made two good points. Mr. Jankowski, you pay taxes, and Mr. Young, Dr. Young, you pay taxes. But you pay taxes for the national parks. Do you think it's wrong to pay a fee to go into national parks since we collect countless dollars in that?
I believe on the national park, as it's determined whether at local or state level, and I visit many parks, I pay my portion, and I think that's how the local or the state.
Just so you understand, the federal government takes taxes to run the Park Service. We supplement that with fees that you pay entering. It appears as though you said yes. I just want to make sure we understand. Look, I came from the private sector. Just because taxes are paid doesn't mean those who use over and above that get a free ride. That's. I hope neither one of you was actually saying that.
I agree with you, but I believe in the importance of the randomness of the data collection, at least regarding the sector.
Right, and that's the second point. And Mr. Clay, you and I probably agree on this much more than we'll ever disagree. You made a statement, though, that you support specifically the mandate. Just as you were coming in, Director Groves had said that he wasn't sure, because he doesn't have the full data about what the cost would be and whether or not he could get, if you will, through statistical sampling or some other secondary check, whether or not he could get equal accuracy or near equal accuracy through a system that would not be mandated. He only knew that Canada had gone from not mandated to not mandated, and it didn't work out so well. So probably Canada supports your decision that we can't just go automatically to not mandated, but perhaps Director Grove could just repeat what he had said about the possibility that we could get to a hybrid.
And before that happens, if the gentleman,
of course, I'd yield.
Would yield. You know, the ACS, what we found over the last 5 or 6 years, was beneficial. It really filled in some gaps between the decennial census, and it helped us understand and get a clear picture about this country, about its growth, about what areas were growing, which ones were shrinking, and I think that's beneficial.
And Lacey, that's one of the areas of our greatest agreement, is that this information is powerful and beneficial. I think everyone on down below, the witnesses, all agreed. What we're trying to do is more nuanced than that. But that's why I said we're going to have a lot of agreement on the need to collect this data, at least most of it. You know, we can all argue over specific questions. But Director Groves, could you just sort of reiterate how you would get briefly, and I know you're going to answer in writing for the committee, but how you'd briefly get from what you don't know to what you might be able to know?
And before he answers,
I'd yield to the gentleman.
Does that mean that the majority would support an increased appropriation for the census?
Well, that's why I wanted to follow up with my business side folks to make sure they understood that the source of funding, if there's an increase in cost for this valuable information, might in fact come in some way, at least slightly, from the users. But Director Grove was very good to say that it wouldn't be completely free regardless. Director?
Thank you.
So just to get our facts on the table, we think that the voluntary nature is in the rough ballpark of about $60 to $70 million a year. So that's a key factor in your going forward. And then the critical scientific work that hasn't been done is, even with that other money, would the characteristics of those not participating bias the statistics so that all of the uses we've just heard about are indeed threatened? And we don't have the right research to answer that.
Thank you. Thank you, Director. That's very helpful to us, for all of us to know what we do know and what we don't know. And thank you for the $60 million figure. That's perhaps that makes my colleague on the other side of the aisle more optimistic that we can reach consensus. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Missouri and the gentleman from California. On behalf of all of us, we want to thank our panelists for a very informative, lively discussion. Whenever we balance competing interests, especially when those interests are very important on both sides, it makes for an instructive, informative hearing. So thank you for your expertise, your comedy, and how you've interacted with one another and with the members. And with that, we are adjourned.